I'll talk to you in English. English. Is that all right? I can try in French. We know that a quarter of the world's languages are spoken in the Pacific region. It's an incredibly wealthy area from a linguistic point of view if we take Papua New Guinea into account as well. And a lot of the records of these languages were made by missionaries or anthropologists and linguists in the past. So I'm talking about the records of the languages now. The trouble is that for a lot of the languages, the records are held in these kinds of conditions. So researchers have kept the records, but they haven't looked after them very well. And our discipline, linguistics, anthropology, has never really emphasised the importance of the primary records. It's always emphasised the importance of the analysis. And so you could say that this is really a colonial enterprise in that First World researchers go to the Pacific, take what they want, write their papers, and there's very little that goes back into the Pacific. So here's an example. I looked at the number of grammars written by linguists since the year 2000. So very recently, and there's been a lot of ideology recently about the importance of documenting languages and getting materials back to communities. Since the year 2000, 683 grammars have been written. And if we look in the online language archives, 439 of those languages have fewer than 19 items in an archive. So very few items archived, primary materials from those languages. So the problem is that most linguists are still not archiving their primary materials. And so then we have this problem. This is a young woman from Chuuk in Micronesia who says, whatever happens to the previous research? What benefits were there to our community? Were researchers who seek to get their PhDs merely exploiting us, or was it for a greater good? When do we see products and results and not more study? I think it's a really important question that we all have to address, specifically us as white researchers from the outside. Now, one of the important theorists of decolonising research, of course, is Linda Tuiwai-Smith from New Zealand, who says that scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism. She says that imperialism and colonialism brought complete disorder to colonised people, disconnecting them from their histories, their landscapes and their languages. And that Indigenous knowledges, cultures and language and the remnants of Indigenous territories remain as sites of struggle. So it's not something, I mean, the thing we talk about with colonisation sometimes is as if it's happened and now we have a post-colonial period where somehow everything's stopped. Well, of course it doesn't. It continues. And linguistics has always been part of this colonial project. Now, I think there are a lot of good examples of linguists who have nice relationships with communities and who do give materials back. I don't want to criticise all linguists, me included. In a volume on preserving the anthropological record, Donald Tuzin, for whom the Melanesian Archives at the University of San Diego is named, says that preservation alone is not enough. An ethnographic legacy packed in shoeboxes and in tea chests across the 6 inhabited continents is no legacy at all. So the problem of linguists, anthropologists keeping their materials in their offices and not allowing other people to get access to them. So a group of us in Australia in 2003 set up a project to find these materials and to digitise them for the future. This project is called Paradisic. We've been going now for 15 years. And the collection has 48 terabytes of data, nearly 8,000 hours of audio, 9,000 hours of audio. And you can see it's a significant collection of materials. And you can also see from the map that they cover a big area. A lot of it is focused on the Pacific. So what we're doing is we're trying to find tapes that people have created in the past. We're digitising analogue recordings. We're also trying to identify existing collections. So if there are records in existing collections, we don't need to recreate them, but we can point to them. And we want to make this archive data available in meaningful ways to the communities that it came from originally. So we see archives, linguistic archives, as serving both a research need and a community need, and these things can work together. In the archive, we can prepare records using licenses, which means people know how they can use these records. The licenses are prepared by the researchers or by the communities that they came from. And it's extremely important to do this. We know that the Museum of Brazil burned to the ground a month ago, and that museum had many records of Brazilian languages, and that was the only copy of the records of those Brazilian languages. So it's a massive loss, and we know about the artefacts, we've heard about the artefacts, Egyptian artefacts, Brazilian artefacts, but language artefacts as well. So it's extremely important to digitise and to make copies and to have lots of copies in different places. So in our collection we have audio records dating back to the 1950s. We have textual material, people have written stuff, biblical translations going back to the late 1800s. In many cases these are the only record of the language. And here are some typical examples. So Stephen Worm, who was the professor of linguistics at ANU, Nick's predecessor, had a lot of tapes from the Solomon Islands sitting in his house when he died. They're completely inaccessible to anybody in the Solomon Islands. And so on, you can see significant numbers, 114 tapes, 180 tapes, 300 tapes from Papua New Guinea. Here's an example of the material that we hold from French Polynesia. If you can see it, there are little bits and pieces of material of various kinds. Some of it is Tahitian instructional material, some of it is field recordings. We put a strong emphasis on working with cultural agencies in the Pacific. So this is the Vanuatu Cultural Centre. We've digitised 200 tapes with the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, and we return them to them. All of our work is also indexed by the Open Language Archives community. This is a wonderful international service. For every language in the world, they produce a page like this. Every language in the world has a 3-letter code, one of these 3-letter codes. And if you use that URL, you can find all the information in language archives of the world that are in the Open Language Archives community. Our collection in Paradisic, every day, OLAC takes our catalogue and puts it into their system. So if we put a new record into our collection today, tomorrow this will be updated. So it's a very good way of finding information about all of these small languages that we're talking about. What we also did then was took that information and mapped it. So this is a crude sort of map looking at within those archives languages that have fewer than 20 resources, fewer than 150 or more than 150. So very gross figures. And you can see for most of these languages in French Polynesia, in the archives, there are very few records. So Tahitian and Cook Island Maori Rarotongan have lots of material in the archives, but the rest of the languages don't have many records in the archives. One of the problems is that library catalogues don't tell you what language they have material in. So there's lots of great material in library catalogues, but it's not marked properly. So here we have the Humboldt University in Berlin has a collection of Tahitian, but they say it's in the country Australia. Okay, and there are many catalogues like this. So we started a project called Lost and Found, where we ask anthropologists, linguists, musicologists if they have any tapes that they need to have digitised. And they can fill in this survey. We then get in touch with them and we try to digitise their tapes. So here are some examples of tapes that we've found in that way. So Don Kulik, very famous for all his work he did on child language acquisition and ideologies of language, but his tapes were sitting in his office in Sweden. Frasinger's work in North Africa, and so on. These tapes were all found using this survey. We then negotiated with the collectors and we digitised those collections. One of the other things we need to do is to enrich the metadata. Many of these early collections have very little information. So Stephen Gagau is a Motu man. He's a Papua New Guinean who works in our office in Sydney, and he's going through listening to a lot of the Papua New Guinea materials and putting in extra material there. In the Divine University in Madang, there was a market stall where recordings were played at the market stall, and people there were asked for information that was put into a spreadsheet and sent back to us. So that's a great example. We would love to do that much more. So one of the problems is getting material back to local areas. We can send a hard disk with recordings, but the problem with that is that a hard disk just has a list of files and it's very difficult to know what's on it. So we've been working on a way of using a small transmitter like this, a Wi-Fi transmitter that has a USB drive on it. And so here's an example where we took this back to a village in Vanuatu. You can load all the files relevant to that local area onto this, and then people can access it on their phones. Because many people don't have computers, USB sticks aren't that useful. So here we have people in the village looking at their phones, and they're looking at records of their parents and grandparents talking straight on their phone. So this device, it's very interesting. So I suggest that what we're doing is trying to decolonise the archive. It's not enough to do nothing. Simple inaction is almost always the worst choice to make. Doing nothing is actually a choice. Thoughtful repatriation of ethnographic materials can assist not only in the decolonisation of anthropology and linguistics, but in empowering both communities and the people who comprise them by allowing easier access to a greater range of ethnographic information. Without language archives, we wouldn't be able to do this. We need more language archives in the world. We need one in Tahiti. On the one hand, the archive is run and maintained by us, so it's another neocolonial enterprise, if you like, because we're taking this material. On the other hand, I think we're taking responsibility for not only ourselves but our ancestors and making this material available in a form of post-colonial restitution. Thank you. Little flyers if anybody